somebody messaged us and said that they were engaged to be married, and their fiance, they found out that they were hooked on pornography, and she was asking if she should still marry him or if that's a deal breaker, if she should cut it off. What would you say to her?
I would say marry him if you're okay with that continuing and probably getting worse. It's
Yeah.
kind of a fatalistic answer,
Okay.
but like if that's happening at this point, like don't assume that he's going to change. Like when people assume that another person's going to change, then it's just a recipe for disaster.
Right. And I guess it would also, wouldn't you say it would depend on him, like his response to her discovering it and his disposition towards pornography?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's true. And it also depends on whether she's a professing believer and he's a professing believer, in my opinion, just because if she's a professing believer and he's not, then what's she doing anyway?
Yeah. Like I would probably, would you say it might be best to seek counsel from somebody that knows the two of you and is a godly person, you know? So the most mature believer you know, and if you can discern that they're discerning, which is very difficult, uh, these things are complicated, but I think by and large you should pause the engagement, and here's why. Every client that I know that is hooked on porn has a rage problem, like 95%. So, and even some of the guys that have told me I don't have a rage problem, they actually will later come up and confess, well, no, actually I do. So I don't know what is going on there. My theory is that maybe porn is providing it's giving like a certain level of stimulation, and that high stimulation is causing them to just be really wired, and there's a level of irritability that comes with your spouse finding out that you're doing something like that. And so it's just a setup for years of work, like really hard, painful work that's unnecessarily painful. Because we're adaptable beings. If you were to break off the engagement, which is one of the hardest decisions you would ever have to make, it does seem like it would just be a period of time where if you were to meet somebody that's not hooked on pornography, that person and that person is godly, you would almost completely forget about your prior engagement.
Yeah.
I know that sounds crazy in the moment because it feels so real. Like this is the person I'm supposed to marry. This is my one shot. This is my one chance. But you'll hate yourself if you marry somebody that's addicted.
It's true. Yeah, it sometimes in the moment it seems like, well, we've already spent all this time together, like we've already maybe even like already planned the wedding, already spent the money, but have the long-term vision to imagine the inevitable, which is spending the rest of your life together, or
Right.
or worse, not, and just the pain that's going to be associated with that.
Yes, it's high risk, low reward investment. But again, not everyone is the same, right? So
Yeah.
it really comes down to get help from somebody. Like talk to somebody. Don't just make the decision by yourself. You probably you're when people are in that stage of a relationship, engaged to be married, unless they've been together for 15 years, you're probably not in the best emotional state to make a clear decision. You know, it's like all those feelings of love, right? Is just it's not like I'm not trying to say that it's fake. It's just not realistic, and that quickly will wear off.
Yeah.
And so the relationship has to be deeper than just you connect well. And that kind of goes back to the purpose of marriage. Seems like marriage is really, number one, to be conformed to the image of Christ. That's why you get married. But number two, there is the idea of, if you don't have self-control, it's to avoid fornication. But there's a clear difference, and this is so key, because this is one of the things that not just clients, like people at church, I've talked to this about. Oftentimes you'll find, like, we had one guy who was addicted to pornography, and he was using the passage, well, I'm burning, so I need to get married, right? But Paul's not saying, hey, if you're already like habitually going to prostitutes and fornicating and watching porn, solve that sin problem with marriage. That's not what he's saying. He's more saying, like, avoid fornication that you haven't already been ensnared in, right? I don't think Paul is thinking to himself, okay, so if you burn and you're like a slave to sin, then you should absolutely get married.
Yeah, agreed. And I think you mentioned the connection with rage and sexual morality.
Right.
I think you're right that there is the stimulation aspect, and there's also the aspect of somebody who's constantly going after the gratification of the flesh. In one way, is like the flesh is never satisfied, and so the flesh finds multiple ways to manifest, and it's like the more you're feeding it, the more severe the problem is going to become. And so, like, sexual morality, giving place to that and making provision for that is going to mean that it's also going to be cropping up in other areas.
Yeah, one of the pieces of armor is the breastplate of righteousness, and like, it's amazing. Like, it's not so much like being righteous is this magical guard against sin. It's more, he says earlier in the chapter, be angry and do not sin. Like, don't let the sun go down on your anger. So letting the sun go down on your anger is staying in this state of in the flesh. And so you're unguarded, right, for all these onslaughts to come.
Yep.
And if you think of pornography, if it's habitual enough, it's like going out to war without armor on. If you're
analogy.
So rage is just an added struggle that you're being attacked with because you're giving yourself to pornography. It's like even simple things like I heard a pastor say one time, this is amazing, that there are certain sins that you give yourself to, like, that are totally disconnected from pornography, like not even related, but because they bring you back into the flesh, you're more set up for an attack, and you have less power against it. So the idea of don't quench the spirit. What is the fire of the spirit other than his power, right?
Yeah.
Like, so it's like me doing something simple like lying last night to my wife, for example. If I lie to her, and it's like the next day I grieve the Spirit of God, and he maybe is not with me in the same way he would have been if I would have embraced the righteous pain of honesty.
Yeah, that's true. And like, when you think about the contrast in Galatians between the works of the flesh, he says the works of the flesh are evident, drunkenness, idolatry, fornication, all these things. And then the contrast is with the fruit of the Spirit. Now the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, etc. And so when you think about the works of the flesh, like, why does he call it the works of the flesh? Well, because it's something you're doing, like it's like a groove that you get into. Whereas the fruit of the Spirit is something that God is doing in you. But when you're in that groove, when you're in that like rut of the works of the flesh, it's like you start out, it's almost like you get promoted, You
Huh.
know, like you start out like you start out like bagging groceries, and like before you know it, you're like the CEO. Um, you just like you just keep going, and there's no like that's why repentance is so critical. It's not just a matter of like when I'm in the works of the flesh, like eventually I just grow out of it, or you know, change my mind, like okay, yeah, maybe I shouldn't do that. Like that's why repentance is so catastrophic, because it's like it's being rescued from that rut that you've gotten into.
Hmm. Yeah. So another question that I had for you that came up. So my wife is in this group. I think it's a Facebook group for our neighborhood, and somebody wrote in and said, "Hey, like my son has been acting up. He's been just really. Um, he's a teenager, and he's been really vicious, and somehow it came out that he was on pornography. I'm not sure how that came about. And my wife, being who she is, said, "Hey, he needs to quit that. Like, that's probably the root of many of the issues in the home." And she said, "No, he doesn't. This is what men do."
Hmm.
So, and she said, my husband is a psychologist. And Alexa said, "Well, that's amazing. My husband is a biblical counselor." So they had this online battle, which I never, full disclosure, I never encourage you to do that because it doesn't really get anywhere. But um, what do you think is the problem with modern psychology today? If you could like reduce it down, what would be like the root issue, the root of the matter, why psychology is so it's so defective?
Hmm. It's a really good question. I mean, if man were purely a soulish being, like body and soul, then there would be nothing wrong with psychology, because psychology, you know, comes from psychos, the soul. So it's really the study of the soul, and it identifies uh, really deep patterns. It, you know, it recognizes kind of those some of those ruts that people get into, and tries to get them out. But the problem is that it doesn't recognize that we are also spirit beings. Like there's this
Mm.
spirit element, and so you know where you have the soul is like this sort of animating life force. The spirit is that part of us that can be connected to God. It's um, and so the soul is like the mediator between the body and the spirit. It's the way that we sort of express ourselves. So anyway, all that to say, there wouldn't be anything wrong with psychology if we were just soulish, but we're spiritual, and so if you're not addressing that element, then you're destined to failure. Right? Like because psychology would say, well, the only thing wrong with pornography is that it's just um, like our society hasn't evolved to the point where you can really like be an accepted productive member of society when you have this addiction. But if at some point we did, then you would be fine. So it doesn't recognize the aspect of like this is sin, and sin is killing you spiritually.
Yeah. What would you say on that note to, let's say this woman actually has a high functioning user in her house, so like her husband's on porn and he's a high functioning user. In other words, you don't need to evolve to a certain state so that you can function in society normally. He's actually functioning well and he's using porn. What's so bad about that?
Yeah, well, so that's like a great example. Psychology would say, well, you know what? He's probably fine then.
Exactly.
So you know, there you go. Like
Like
if
more power to him. Like he's reached the pinnacle of what it means to be a human. Like he can be hedonistic, have all these pleasures and thrills. It's like Carl Truman's book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. He's like, only in our day can you be a businessman and the man at the brothel
Mm.
in one life. Like back then you had to like choose your path. You couldn't like you couldn't be like the successful upstanding citizen and then you're like hanging out with women of the night. It usually was bad, right? Well, because there's not modern medicine, so you get sexually transmitted diseases galore.
Yeah.
There's no birth control, there's no abortion, so like it would get out, hey, like this person had my child. Like you had to choose a path,
Right.
and now you can actually have both.
Mm. Yeah, it was pretty obvious back then, like who was like totally degenerated, but not so much now. Yeah. So that guy who's the high functioning porn addict, um, for psychology, there's no issue with that. But from a spiritual perspective, like he's cut off from the life of God. Now, of course, pornography addiction is not the cause of being cut off from the life of God. It's an overall symptom, like because you are dead and because you've never had the power of the Spirit to work in you and to overcome sin, then that you're going to become ensnared in all different types of sin, whether it's pornography or pride or other types of lust or greed or things like that. And so that's the issue is being at enmity with God, being cut off from the life of God, and being really like given over to sin. Now, if your hope is to have your best life now, then go for it.
Yeah. So one last thing. So you've said before that you see one of the problems with pornography is that it mothers men. So it kind of nurtures boyhood indefinitely. Yeah. Could you explain that?
Yeah. So it occurred to me that virtually all men want to be mothered. They want someone who cares for them unconditionally, who loves them unconditionally, and who basically just nurtures them. And when a lot of men try to get that out of their wife, and when they realize like, okay, my wife isn't doing a good job being my mother, then they're like, okay, well, where else can I find a mother? And so pornography provides a natural substitute, because like these women are giving the impression their act is to show like, hey, all I care about is you right now. Like you're my main concern on it. And it's coming from a screen, and there's no need to give. It's all taking. It's all being cared for just in that in that moment. So I think that's one of the big draws of porn.
Yeah, so it's perpetuating a feminine characteristic in men. You don't really think of like a man using pornography as a feminine activity.
Yeah.
That usually, I mean, it's the research is out. You didn't really need to research it though. Men are way more users of pornography, subscribers to porn websites than women are.
Yeah. Well, I think so that would be the difference between being feminine and being what what Paul calls in 1 Corinthians 6 effeminate, or literally like a soft man. And so it's not so much that he's being feminine, it's he's being a soft man. Like he's given himself over to softness, to comfort, to ease, to convenience. And that same word is used of John the Baptist when Jesus says, hey, when you guys went out to see John the Baptist, were you looking for someone, in soft clothing? Like, hey, those men are in king's palaces. Like, you can find plenty of soft men in king's palaces, like men who have given themselves over to luxury and ease. He's like, that wasn't John the Baptist. And so yeah, the soft man is the one who has given himself over to that. And so it's no surprise that he says the soft men, the effeminate, will not inherit the kingdom of God, because you can't go after God and take up your cross and follow Christ while simultaneously pursuing ease and convenience and comfort.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really good. So what would you say, let's say somebody's watching this and they're like, okay, I'm convinced I need to quit porn. It's bad. and I've maybe God is working on them, and they actually see it as an offense to a holy God, and not just as something that's producing shame and a lack of motivation in their life. But what if somebody were to come to you and say, I feel like I'm too far gone. Like, I've had an addiction for a decade, 2 decades. So, like, but they say to you at the same time they want to quit. What would be like the first step of quitting porn?
Well, I think the first step would be, like, if somebody has actually gotten to that state where they recognize like who they are before God, then they're in a really good place. Like Jesus said, I didn't come for the healthy but for the sick. And so if someone is sick, then they're in like the perfect place to come to Jesus, the good physician. So that's what I would say. Like, hey, recognize who you are and recognize the only provision that God has made for wicked sinners like you are, and go to Him. It's in Jesus Christ and Him alone. And when that happens, like being born again of the Spirit, like no longer just having the power of the flesh in you, but also the power of the Spirit. Paul says I think it's in Ephesians, he says the flesh lusts against the Spirit and the Spirit lusts against the flesh. And so before there was only the flesh, and now there's a battle. And so yeah, now you're in the thick of it. But as Jesus says, with man it is impossible, but with God all things are possible. And so now there's actually hope.
Yeah, it almost seems like you're saying that just somebody going, "Wow, I'm really broken. Like I'm really messed up," is like a good thing. You usually don't view that as a good thing, but that's a necessary thing to happen for you to stop like pushing it under the rug and going, well, it's like what is it in Homer Simpson, he's like failing this class that he has to take for work or something, and he's like, well, if I really tried, like I'd get an A in it. And then he actually tries, and then he fails. So he's like, man, it was almost worse like coming out of the fog and looking at myself in the mirror, because now I actually really know I'm like a nobody. but like for people on porn, there's no diminishing returns to coming out of the fog and going, you know what, I'm enslaved to this. Like I can't stop, and I need help. That's like, if you do that, you're leaps and bounds beyond so many people. Not that it's a pecking order or a dominance hierarchy or there's competition, but so many people don't get to that point. Like I know I had one guy that one of my first clients was in his 60s, and he had just come out of the fog and said, I need help. And he had been addicted since he was a kid. So, like, don't wait till you're 60 years old to come out of the fog.
But like you said though, that like make sure you like why do you want to get help?
Yeah,
right. Because there's a lot of reasons that you could want to get help that aren't actually gonna bring you out of it or really gonna be helpful, right?
Yeah. Jesus has given us a specific way for how people deal with. And it's not, you mentioned to me one of the problems of modern psychology is seeing everything as an illness, and or seeing yourself as a victim of something. Or like I was talking to one guy at the local seminary who's a biblical counselor, and he was thinking that all of it comes down to homeostasis, like societal conditions push you into comfort zones that are bad, and so it's a breaking out of homeostasis. And I just was like, man, I don't feel like you're getting it. Like, it's the root of the matter is that we are enslaved to sin. Like, sin is like this power that reigns over us. It's not just something you do; it's a power, and like because of the evil nature within. And I mean, this has been talked about for thousands of years, but it's like the novelty of a new idea. It can just take over. It comes and goes,
Yeah.
and it withers, right? Yeah, it's the problem is us. It's a heart problem.
Yeah.